Thank you so much for engaging again, and I'd like to see if there are some people from a couple of groups that would come forward to share what it is that your group is talking about regarding ministerial wisdom.
Good afternoon. I'm Stefan Munker, pastor at Grace Lutheran Church in Mount Prospect. And in our group, we had a conversation about the last comments that were made about sometimes breaking down those walls between, for example, what is a learning institution and what is a place of ministry. And from my own personal experience, it is oftentimes so difficult sitting down at my desk on Monday morning and thinking about the to-do list that I'd have, starting with like the sermon for next Sunday, and I'm trying to work my way through this to-do list as it grows by, say, the minute or hour. And to really take the time to go outside, sometimes like literally outside the church building, to encounter other people and get to know them, find out their needs, and minister together. So for congregations, it can be very difficult to kind of see beyond themselves, beyond kind of the events that we always do this fall, and trying to maintain the kinds of structures that exist without kind of stopping and seeing, you know, where is God active, or where does God send us to, so that we can definitely do the ministry that God calls us to. So we resonated with that.
Thank you so much. Is there another person?
Pastor Julie Ryan, Christ the Mediator Lutheran Church in Chicago, about 2 miles from here, which was occupied by the seminary when it first got going in the 60s and 70s. I think the real presence in flesh and blood that we have to offer is one of the greatest gifts in this time when friendship is something you click on Facebook, when, you know, there's all kinds of illusory kinds of relationships, and you're not really sure where anybody quite is, that the flesh and blood friendship and commitment and presence is truly a treasure. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
Great, thank you.
And cheer everyone on.
Thank you. Dr. Klein?
I won the election in my small group to speak. And our group thought that the vocation of the seminary under its new leadership is to combine the centeredness of Bishop Burke with the pedagogy of Yehiel Curry.
Wow. What wisdom we have heard. Okay, now we move to Professor Bonnie Miller-McLemore, and then to you.
Great. Well, I am really grateful to be here. I have been blessed by the friendship and collegiality with Jim Neiman, your soon-to-be official president. I hold you, Jim, in the highest esteem as friend, as colleague, as scholar, and in most recent months as spouse and parent. And I really celebrate with LSTC this moment and the wider Lutheran community. It's a wonderful moment in the history of your school and the wider church for all the promise that it holds. I too was a little daunted by the ministerial wisdom, even though it's a topic I love and have been thinking about for decades. I was helped by Jim and his wisdom as a practical theologian when he suggested that we bring to mind a minister and ask ourselves, where do we see wisdom, prudence, a blessed way of knowing, and facility in the faith? A few years ago, I quit attending the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, where my membership stands. And sporadically, I attend other disciple churches in Nashville. More regularly, I find myself in an Episcopalian congregation on the Vanderbilt University campus. Why? To be honest, my disciple roots run really deep. I am convicted by its non-hierarchical view of ministry It's non-creedalism, it's believers' baptism, it's communal distribution of the Lord's Supper into the congregation, it's low Christology, and even non-Trinitarian Godhead. All ideals less familiar to Episcopalians. Or Lutherans, for that matter. So why am I drawn to this Episcopalian congregation, where I doubt I will ever be a fully believing member? Although not solely due to the campus minister and head priest, it definitely has something to do with her. Steeped in the love of wisdom and the love of her Episcopalian tradition, her claim on God's Spirit is really hard to describe. So I'll name some outward signs. The community she has overseen has outgrown its tiny university building and now fills to capacity the large main university chapel. The worship has cohesion and energy. The preaching is compelling and intelligent. The music moves us, although in Nashville, amazing musicians grace almost all the churches. The sense of mission is tangible, especially towards a residential program that Becca began 15 years ago for women who have survived street lives of prostitution, trafficking, and addiction. Maybe even more, people seem to love being in worship, and it's clear she does. One Sunday after a lot of travel, she tells us, "I'm so glad to be back." And then with a smile that I think clues everyone in that she's going to say something with a lot of hubris, she says, "No one does Eucharist as good as we do." She says the liturgy of bread and cup with the same presence, maybe centeredness that we've heard spoken of, and sincerity as her invitation to the table, which is so familiar to me as a disciple. All are welcome. Let us walk in love as Christ has loved us and given himself for us. And I want to follow, even though processing forward to partake of the bread with open hands is really bodily alien to me. She definitely knows something about practical wisdom that I have sought to study, these many years. What is it? How did she come to inhabit it, and how might we convey it to students? Perhaps the first thing to say is obvious, but most theological faculty have yet to comprehend or admit it. Practical wisdom is something ministers often have in more abundance than faculty. They have it when they follow their lives of Christ into the seminary. They have it at least in deeply intuitive ways when they find themselves in their ministries, and they find ways to refine it through practice, or ultimately, they lose their jobs, or even worse, they forsake the vitality of the religious community and Christian faith. Theological educators seldom risk our jobs over lack of such practical knowledge. In fact, the inverse, the more theory, the better. And consequently, we haven't had much interest in understanding it until recent decades. That is, the formal church and the academy both know a lot more about what Aristotle called episteme, by which he meant, or we think of the term, propositional, conceptual doctrine and theory. And we know how to convey that knowledge through lecture, memorization, examination, rote learning, and scholarly publication. We know so much less about two other kinds of knowledge that Aristotle included in his depiction of the threefold intellectual virtue, techne and phronesis, and how to shape them in relationship to episteme. To be clear, I am not deriding episteme or theory. If I didn't have a love for theological knowledge, I wouldn't have survived the academy, and I wouldn't even know what to say here today. Nor do I want to naively romanticize the wisdom of laity, ministers, or congregations as if theological education has nothing to offer by way of prophetic correction, rich knowledge of scriptural history, analysis of complicated theological questions and debates about God, heaven, finitude, grief, child development, and so forth. Students have a lot to learn on such matters. Rather, I'm urging greater attention to the intelligence within techne and phronesis and a closer relationship between these two ways of knowing and episteme. In this, I'm actually agreeing with, but also pushing past senior colleagues that Don Browning, who lived in Hyde Park, and Thomas Groom and others, who 2 or 3 decades ago tried to reclaim phronesis. These theological educators of the 80s and 90s undersold, I think, the relative value of techne, the knowledge needed to make things well, and the ways in which learning ministry includes important material dimensions of honing a craft, where to stand, how to or not to hold someone else's hand, and so forth. We are rightly anxious, I think, we were, about the distortions of this kind of knowledge, a sort of modern technical rationality that might reduce everything to a means-ends reasoning. But in our worry about the dangers of teaching skills, I think we forgot the intricate relationship between basic moves, rules of thumb, the musical scales, so to speak, and musical artistry and mastery. The former are necessary stepping stones to the latter, and great musicians never leave scales entirely behind. Unthinking dismissal of learning a craft as, quote, mere know-how, is as if such know-how is easy to master, overlooks its role in the greater pursuit of ministerial wisdom. I think craft know-how is at least partly valuable because faith and ministry are deeply embodied. What our bodies do matters. Bodies shape our faith. I'm not sure I will ever entirely overcome a sense that it's not quite right to process forward for the Eucharist and exemplify in my body a theology with which I do not entirely agree, that one goes to the altar to receive one by one, hands outstretched, Christ's body and blood from a priestly mediator of Christ's grace and God's grace. There is, of course, more than techne involved in ministerial wisdom, but people and leaders of faith possess wisdom within our bodies, worthy of greater care and attention. Walking forward and eating, or sitting, passing a tray and eating, are a small part of a whole constellation of concrete actions that make up the life of faith. The impact of habituated body action on ministry and faith is an essential part of ministerial wisdom that needs more of our attention. We also know more now than we did in the 80s about the value of, or the complexity of phronesis, or practical knowledge. To move from a rule-based beginner to a virtuoso expert requires more than theories and formulas. One must have experience with cases and practice. To borrow the words of an innovative Danish sociologist that Jim actually recommended and whose name he's tried to help me pronounce, Bent Flivberg. I still can't do it. He has wonderful words on this. He says, if people were exclusively trained in context-independent knowledge, episteme, for example, the kind of knowledge that forms the basis of textbooks and computers, they would remain at the beginner's level in the learning process. This is the limitation of analytic rationality. It's not adequate for the best results in learning a profession as a student, researcher, or practitioner. He's not saying theories don't have a place. They do. But expert practical knowledge or ministerial wisdom is context-dependent. It requires a dexterity of thought that draws from familiarity with, he says, several thousand concrete cases. He concludes his article reminding readers about an insight from Thomas Kuhn, which in my reading is quite damning of formal theology as it has developed in the last 2 centuries, and really supportive of the direction practical theology has gone. He writes, a discipline without a large number of thoroughly executed case studies is a discipline without systematic production of exemplars. And a discipline without exemplars is an ineffective one. Just to enumerate all this succinctly, if not maybe oversimply, practical context-dependent knowledge is not inferior to general theoretical context-independent knowledge. We do a disservice if we think we can enumerate it in terms of general rules or theories, pictures, stories. Your story. Tell 1,000 words, and we should use such means of knowing more often. I think you'll remember the story of Becca Stevens, or whatever I revealed about myself in describing her wisdom. More than anything, I told you from Flivbjerg and others. People attain such wisdom gradually over time through practice, several thousand cases, or the 1,000 pots a novice potter throws to become a master of clay. This is a trajectory in which theological educators, I think as you have invited us, should participate. We participated in it relatively briefly, but powerfully, so we need to get better acquainted and connected to the places or spaces of practice and faith from which and to which our students go. One last thing I need to say, one thing I've learned through conversation with Dorothy Bass, who will be here tomorrow, and also another good friend, Kathleen Cahalan, who is here. As Dorothy points out, there's a difference and an intricate relationship between practical wisdom and cosmic wisdom. So we need to make room for unknowing. Unknowing or not knowing, as Kathleen argues, must be accounted for as an intrinsic aspect of knowledge if we are to aspire to wisdom. We've idealized speculative wisdom and sometimes created a dichotomy between it and phronesis. But rarely have we turned to the traditions of spiritual practice where there is an intricate relationship with not knowing. For Christian spiritual writers, Kathleen suggests not knowing constitutes a deep and important way of knowing that for many years was an experience found only in prayer. Unknowing characterizes our theories, our practices, our relationships, and divine reality itself. So theological educators, of which I'm assuming there are many of you out there, we are so eager in our desire to instruct, sometimes forget to make a sanctioned place for human wandering and divine expansiveness as ever so essential to our knowing. If Garrison Keillor is right, I think he's already got a few references here, hasn't he? Lutherans probably don't go around bragging about your wisdom and the wonderful wisdom in your tradition. But I have had the immense fortune to witness and to participate in it. And I am so glad to join this conversation today about strengthening our fragile means and our immense hopes for living in and handing on God's gospel.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Bonnie. And now, Pastor Jhon Correa.
Challenge. A challenge for me is to be sitting here right now. And perhaps I was told to speak from here. And in the break, Buddy stopped by and said, "You're going to be a good boy, right? And you're going to sit right." And he's laughing there. And it's a challenge for me, honestly. I'm wondering if you are wondering, too, if I'm going to stand up. Right? And when I say this, honestly, this creates chaos. Because then I have those who are in charge of this event worry now. What's going to happen? Are we going to be able to hear him? What is he going to do? And honestly, I'm going to stand up. And because I need to be who I am.
Yes, yes.
Wisdom. Three years ago, I appear in this city, Racine. And they were not ready, as perhaps they were not, and the sound were not, and they needed to start looking for new ways in order to respond to something that was happening right there at that moment. So now everybody has to stand up and worry and move, and right? And the bishop of the synod in Wisconsin has to start looking like, okay, this is a Latino person that is coming, moving from another denomination, and he had been in relationship in the previous year with the synod talking. Nothing has happened yet. So after a year, I said, okay, are we in business or what? What? Yeah, let me know, otherwise then I need to go and knock another door. And then let's go to this congregation, knock a door, and find out and talk. They were not ready. They were a white Anglo congregation, more than 150 years in existence. Danish. And say, Jhon, we are not ready. We don't have any resources. What can we do? One person had the wisdom to say, God will provide. But then we have to start following the wisdom of the institution that I don't want to condemn or mean with this to condemn. But then I have to go through all the hoops, which I believe sometimes or many times are really reasonable to do it. But how do we work that? Are we closing doors right away? Or are we looking into a way how to respond to those needs of this new generation and this new multicultural world? And here they are changing, moving. And we need to do that very often in order to be catching what is happening. So there I was in 2008, already ordained in another church, in another denomination, enrolled into the teen program, and started meeting in houses with people in Racine. Let's sit down, let's have a cup of coffee, let's have some bread, and let's talk, and let's pray. And then it started growing. Not only one meeting, but now we have to have 2, even 3 meetings a week. Because the houses were too small. Time flies, and it was close to a year, and I was already going through all the process and pretty much jump all of them or go through them, whatever. And okay, so I was ready to be ordained in the Lutheran church, and we did it. And we opened a Latino worship service. 3 years later, we are worshiping more than 200 people weekly. The numbers, honestly, doesn't matter to me. Because now I'm looking back and say, we lost a lot. Now we are a massive group that come, show up every Sunday, and see you next week. So we are wondering, how do we go back and open those doors again? And in the last 2 years, finally, out of the 14 Lutheran congregations in Racine, 5, after a long process, decided to sit down and talk seriously about ministry and wisdom. And how do we use our resources, and how do we respond to the needs of the community? And nobody wants to take the challenge to stand up and start moving. Because perhaps I won't be invited again. Or perhaps they will look as, what? And they will start criticizing. I challenge this group of people, the 5 pastors that are meeting, say, if you want to, put a lab idea, and I will do it. And I am willing to close these congregations today, the Latino, and go back and meet every day in their homes. And I will meet those 200 people somehow during the week. What? They are concerned that people are not going into these places that we call temples or sanctuaries. So I say, why don't we go there where they are? Easy. If you want to get to 300 people, how do we go and get there? Right? So, wisdom. When we go there to those houses and we sit down, and one day I didn't sit in a chair, but I sat in a table. They are not to be seen at, right? And then we start a conversation. What are we not supposed to do in church? And then those families were told so many things. Don't get up, be a good boy, and do all these follow things. But now when they come and encounter this new tradition, this new God, which is new for them because never had been preached before, now they have all these regulations. They don't know how to face it. So we sit down and say, so what were you told not to do? And then, after they said that, but I'm not going to go through all the details, we encountered that they needed to be listened. And then after they needed to be listened, they need to be asked for what do they need? What do they want to do? And look what happened in this process. They formed a GED group. 70 adults are taking today the GED program, and hopefully will graduate in a year. Some of them sit down and say, we were not allowed to start our own businesses. And we don't talk about money in church, only when the pastor asks us to give. And we say, how can we generate money for you? In church? Yes, in one of the preaching moments. And we decided to start some co-ops. And we said, are you going to buy all the products that we grow? And the church said, amen, we will. Yes. And we did it. And now 10 single moms grew stuff all this year. And now we are trying to build a greenhouse so that they can keep doing it all year long. And we just went through the city and got all the permits. And we talk that in church and also outside. And some of those single moms doesn't belong to our church. But they do. Hello. Then we say, how do we respond to what you want? Some people wanted to dance in church. I say, what? Let me hear more. And they created an Aztec dance group to dance to the sun, the shiny, the light. And then the discussion, that's not the point, creating a dance Aztec group or a cultural dance. The point was their dresses. When a woman came and said, this is what I saw and this is how I want to dress up. And it was as the native indigenous. Now, do you understand a little bit? Or should I say almost naked? And then some of them were, you are not supposed to do that. And I said, if we are not supposed to do that here, then where? If we are not supposed to look with wonderful and great and holy eyes to a holy creature, so where? If we don't do that at church, then where? Then they were empowered and they were dressed as they wanted to be dressed. And they were in church dancing. And then they were all over Racine, in the papers and even Milwaukee. Now they were empowered over communities. I'm wondering today, to wrap up, is how Emmaus go back to how we started. Because it had been only 3 years for us, and we have lost so much that we had in 2008. And it has been only 3 years. We changed from a coffee table to now a huge, crowded sanctuary where they are struggling that the more than 60 kids that we meet are quiet and sit appropriately and don't move and listen to what the pastor is saying. When we were at home, they were running all over, but also they were listening. And when I was telling the story, they say, yes, I know that one too. And they start jumping from wherever they were. And they were part of that house. We were a family. So that's a question, the struggle that I'm going through right now. How do we, Emmaus, go back to that table where our eyes were opened, where we found all our brokenness, when we were empowered to get the bread and share it with others? How do we go back to that place? But also from that place, how do we live in a daily basis outside next to the other house? Because we never met in one house every week. So that was a challenge. So when is our next meeting? Where? In what house? So may God guide us and help us and hopefully break the bread again and open our eyes at Emmaus so that we can see how can we go back to those places to keep building and empowering so that they can go to Jerusalem, win the power. And also Pharaoh said, let me go, don't want to let you go. And I say, let me go, let me stand up, let me be free, let me be who I am. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So Pastor Correa has raised for us, when do we let our ministerial wisdom lead us to places outside the stated meeting place, when the meeting place is in fact in the homes of people who want to invite others in? So we have again been challenged in some significant ways, and I'd like for you to return to your group and discuss for a minute what it is that you've been challenged by, what it is that you would like to add to ministerial wisdom. We want to hear the wisdom from the assembly.
Ron Martinson from Anchorage, Alaska, which it's good to see you, Jim, again, and your wife. Well, there she is in the back. One of the things I mentioned and I heard was listening. Listening. And the best time to hear what people have to say is by visiting them. And all the years in my ministry, I did a lot of visitation. And some of the people that I talked to when I was bishop in Alaska, I would call one, and I never could find him in the office. And I wondered, does he ever spend time in the office? Well, every morning he did, but with the time difference, I was calling him in the afternoon. And he was never there because he was out visiting people. And I heard the two of you coming and saying you had meetings in homes. And you listened. What do you need? How can we do that? I had a member who never said, we've never done it that way before. He said, what would it take to accomplish this? And I've been using that for 30 years now. It's not that long ago since I discovered how you went about it. Not so much we've never done it that way before, or this is new to us, but rather, what would it take to accomplish that? And I think those are good questions that you address. How can this seminary become that parish that you're trying to serve? How can another seminary help you reach out and so forth? And I'm pleased for what I see in the ELCA. We've had our moments of doubt and difficulty and despair. We're, as you said, in sociological terms, it ain't like it used to be. There are no good old days to go back to. Everything is declining in numbers and so forth, and that, with it goes the decline of income. Mm-hmm. But I guess I would pose the question, what would it take to get the inactive people back? What would it take to help the people who are active become more concerned? And I listened to both of your stories, and some of the things that we've tried as a synod in Alaska and as a parish is telling faith stories. And that's really all you did. That's all you need to do. And why are we so timid about telling our faith stories? Isn't that what brings people to discover not how great is our faith, but how great is our God? Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
So we think about the ministerial wisdom that comes with what would it take for us to do something different. And I think that this panel has done a marvelous job of raising a variety of ideas. Would you please join me in thanking this wonderful panel?